On a crisp Monday morning in September 2018, Sarah Johnson rushed through the marble corridors of the Cincinnati Municipal Court. Her heels clicked against the polished floor as she hurried to courtroom 204. She was already running 10 minutes late, something that went against her usual punctual nature. At 42, Sarah had built a reputation as one of Ohio's most respected journalists, with 3 best-selling biographies under her belt. The courtroom was nearly empty when she entered, with just a handful of people scattered across the wooden benches. The morning sunlight filtered through tall windows, casting long shadows across the room. Judge Robert McKinley, a man in his early 60s with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, sat high on his bench, his face set in what seemed to be a permanent frown. Case number 47,892, Sarah Johnson, traffic violation, the court clerk announced, her voice echoing through the high-ceilinged room. Sarah smoothed her navy blue blazer and approached the podium. She had prepared her explanation carefully. The traffic ticket was for running a red light, but there were extenuating circumstances. She had been rushing to the hospital where her mother had been admitted for an emergency. Judge McKinley looked down at her over his glasses, his expression unchanged. His reputation for being strict preceded him, but seeing him in person was more intimidating than Sarah had expected. He had been on the bench for over 30 years, and his demeanor suggested he had seen and heard every excuse possible. "Ms. Johnson," he began, his voice carrying that particular tone of authority that only decades on the bench could create, "can you explain why you chose to disregard a traffic signal on the evening of August 15th? Sarah cleared her throat. "Your Honor, I understand the seriousness of my violation. However, I was responding to an emergency. My mother had been taken to Mercy Hospital with chest pains, and I was trying to—" "Ms. Johnson," Judge McKinley interrupted. "While I sympathize with your situation, the law doesn't make exceptions for personal emergencies. A red light means stop, regardless of the circumstances. Your decision could have resulted in serious injury or death to others on the road." Sarah noticed how he didn't look directly at her while speaking, instead shuffling through the papers on his desk. The dismissive gesture wasn't lost on her. As a journalist who had interviewed hundreds of people, she was skilled at reading body language. The judge's posture, his tone, and his refusal to make eye contact all suggested he had made up his mind before she even spoke. "Your Honor, I have a clean driving record spanning 20 years, Sarah attempted to continue, but the judge raised his hand, cutting her off again. "Ms. Johnson, this court sees dozens of traffic violations every day. Each person has a story, an excuse, a special circumstance. If we made exceptions based on personal emergencies, we would be undermining the very system designed to keep our citizens safe." The condescension in his voice was clear. Several people in the courtroom shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Sarah stood straight, maintaining her composure despite feeling her cheeks grow warm with a mixture of embarrassment and frustration. Judge McKinley finally looked directly at her, his steel gray eyes cold and distant. "Taking into account your previous clean record, I'm setting the fine at $500 plus court costs. This is actually showing leniency, Ms. Johnson. The maximum fine could have been $1,000. Sarah blinked in surprise. The fine was substantially higher than what was typically given for first-time offenders. She opened her mouth to protest but thought better of it. Years of journalism had taught her when to push and when to step back. "You have 30 days to pay the fine," Judge McKinley continued, already looking down at the next case file. "Next case," he called out, effectively dismissing her. As Sarah gathered her belongings and turned to leave, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had been treated unfairly. In her research for various articles, she had covered numerous traffic court cases. The typical fine for a first offense red light violation was usually between $100 and $250. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah pulled out her reporter's notebook, a habit she had never broken, and jotted down the details of what had just transpired. Something about the interaction felt wrong, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Little did she know that this seemingly routine court appearance would soon take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge both her and Judge McKinley in ways neither could have anticipated. As she pushed through the heavy courthouse doors into the bright morning sunshine, Sarah had no idea that in just a few days, she would be face to face with Judge McKinley again, under very different circumstances. A week after her court appearance, Sarah Johnson sat in the plush conference room of Walker Publishing House in downtown Cincinnati. The glass walls offered a stunning view of the city's skyline, but she was too focused on her notebook to notice. This meeting could be the biggest break of her career. The publishing house had called her in to discuss a major biography project. Linda Martinez, the senior editor at Walker Publishing, sat across from Sarah, her reading glasses perched on the edge of her nose as she reviewed some documents. "Sarah, your work on the governor's biography last year was exceptional. That's why we thought of you for this project." Linda smiled, shuffling through her papers. "We're looking at documenting the life of one of Ohio's most influential judges." Sarah nodded, trying to contain her excitement. Political biographies were her specialty, and judges' stories often contained the kind of complex character development that made for compelling reading. "He should be here any minute," Linda continued, checking her watch. "He's very particular about punctuality." Just then, the conference room door opened. Sarah's heart nearly stopped. Walking into the room, wearing the same wire-rimmed glasses and stern expression, was Judge Robert McKinley. He hadn't noticed her yet, busy greeting Linda with a firm handshake. "Judge McKinley, I'd like you to meet your biographer," Linda began, gesturing toward Sarah. "This is Sarah Johnson, one of our most accomplished." The words trailed off as both Sarah and Judge McKinley locked eyes. The recognition was instant, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. The judge's face went from professional politeness to shocked disbelief in a matter of seconds. "Ms. Johnson," he said stiffly, his voice barely hiding his discomfort. "What an unexpected surprise." Sarah managed to stand and extend her hand, maintaining her professional composure despite the awkward situation. "Judge McKinley," she replied, her voice steady even as her mind raced. Linda looked between them, sensing the tension but not understanding its source. "Do you two know each other?" "We've met," Sarah said diplomatically. "In Judge McKinley's courtroom last week, actually." The judge cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Yes, well, perhaps we should discuss this arrangement, Linda. I'm not sure if Ms. Johnson would be the best fit for this project, given our recent interaction." Linda's eyebrows rose with interest. "Oh, was there a problem?" Sarah spoke up, her journalistic instincts kicking in. "Judge McKinley presided over my traffic violation case. He fined me $500 for running a red light during a family emergency." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda looked from Sarah to the judge, then back to Sarah. "Well," she said finally, "this is certainly interesting." Judge McKinley straightened his tie, clearly uncomfortable. "Linda, surely there are other writers who could handle this project. Someone with more distance from the subject matter." "Actually," Linda said, a slight smile playing at her lips, "this could work in our favor. Sarah's recent experience in your courtroom could add an interesting contemporary perspective to the biography. After all, we're not just looking to document your past achievements, Judge McKinley. We want to show who you are today as well." The judge's face reddened slightly. He clearly hadn't expected this turn of events. Sarah watched as he struggled to maintain his composure, noting how different he looked here compared to his commanding presence in the courtroom. "The publishing house has already approved Sarah for this project," Linda continued. "Her track record speaks for itself. 3 bestsellers, including that brilliant piece on Governor Matthews. Unless you have a specific professional objection." Judge McKinley sat down heavily in one of the leather chairs. "No," he said finally. "No professional objection." He looked at Sarah with a mixture of resignation and curiosity. "Though I must admit, this is not how I envisioned this project beginning." Sarah took out her notebook, her professional mask firmly in place. "Perhaps we could view last week's encounter as valuable research, Your Honor. After all, a biography should show all facets of its subject." The judge's eyes narrowed slightly at her words, catching the subtle challenge in them. Linda watched the exchange with growing interest, clearly sensing she had stumbled onto something more intriguing than a standard biography project. As they began discussing the project's timeline and requirements, Sarah couldn't help but notice how the power dynamic had shifted. A week ago, she had stood before him in his courtroom, subject to his authority. Now, she would be the one documenting his life, interpreting his actions, and sharing his story with the world. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. The following morning, Sarah sat in her home office, staring at her laptop screen. Her finger hovered over the send button of an email she had drafted to Linda Martinez, considering declining the biography project. The past hour had been spent crafting and rewriting the perfect way to say no without burning professional bridges. Her phone buzzed. It was Marcus, her literary agent. She had called him yesterday after the meeting, seeking advice. "Don't you dare send that email," Marcus said before she could even say hello. "Sarah, this is the kind of opportunity that comes once in a career. Judge McKinley's story is huge. But Marcus, you don't understand. The way he treated me in that courtroom." "Actually, I did some research last night," Marcus interrupted, his voice excited. "In the 1980s, McKinley was one of the few white judges who actively fought against racial discrimination in the Ohio judicial system. He made groundbreaking decisions that changed lives. The man was a civil rights pioneer." Sarah leaned back in her chair, surprised. "What? That doesn't match the judge I met last week." "Exactly," Marcus exclaimed. "That's what makes this story so interesting. What happened to change him? When did he start losing touch with his earlier principles?" "Sarah, this isn't just a biography anymore. This is investigative journalism at its finest." As Marcus spoke, Sarah pulled up Judge McKinley's court records on her computer. The contrast between his earlier and recent rulings was striking. In the 1980s, he had been known for his compassionate approach and understanding of systemic inequalities. Now, his rulings showed a pattern of harsh sentences and little consideration for circumstances. Her journalist's curiosity began to override her personal feelings. The publisher specifically chose him because of his civil rights background, she mused aloud. "And they chose you because you're the best at what you do," Marcus added. "Plus, now you have first-hand experience of who he's become." Just then, Sarah's email pinged. It was from Judge McKinley's office. "Dear Ms. Johnson, I have contacted Walker Publishing, requesting a different biographer for my project. I believe our recent interaction might compromise the objectivity of the work. Regards, Judge Robert McKinley." Sarah felt her professional pride kick in. After 20 years of award-winning journalism, was he suggesting she couldn't remain objective? She picked up her phone again. "Marcus, he's trying to have me removed from the project." "Of course he is," Marcus chuckled. "He's probably worried about what you'll uncover. The question is, are you going to let him push you away from what could be the most important story of your career?" Sarah deleted her draft email declining the project. Instead, she began composing a new one to Judge McKinley. "Dear Judge McKinley, I understand your concerns about objectivity. However, as a professional journalist with 2 decades of experience, I can assure you that personal experiences will not cloud my judgment. In fact, they might enhance the biography's authenticity. Your work in the 1980s was groundbreaking. That story deserves to be told properly. I look forward to our first official interview. Best regards, Sarah Johnson." She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Within minutes, her phone rang. It was Linda from the publishing house. "Sarah, I just got off the phone with Judge McKinley," Linda said. "He tried to have you removed from the project, but I stood firm. Your track record speaks for itself, and frankly, I think this tension might lead to a more compelling biography." Sarah smiled. "Thank you for supporting me, Linda." "Don't thank me yet," Linda warned. "He agreed to keep you on the project, but he has one condition. He wants all interviews to be conducted in his chambers at the courthouse." "His comfort zone," Sarah noted. "He's trying to maintain control of the narrative." "Can you handle that?" Linda asked. Sarah thought about the judge's earlier civil rights work, the stark contrast with his current behavior, and the story waiting to be uncovered. "Yes, I can handle it. In fact, I think it's perfect. What better place to understand who he's become than in the very room where he makes his decisions?" After hanging up, Sarah opened a fresh document on her laptop. At the top, she typed, Chapter 1, The Two Faces of Justice. Below it, she began listing questions about the judge's transformation from a civil rights advocate to the man who had fined her so dismissively just a week ago. The biography project was no longer just an assignment. It had become a mission to understand how justice could lose its way, and perhaps, to help find it again. The judge's chambers were exactly as Sarah had imagined. dark wood paneling, leather-bound law books lining the walls, and a massive mahogany desk that seemed designed to intimidate. Judge McKinley sat behind it, looking as uncomfortable as she'd ever seen him. It was their first official interview, 3 weeks after the publishing house meeting. Sarah had spent those weeks researching, digging through old court records, and interviewing people who knew the judge in the 1980s. What she discovered had fascinated her. "Let's start with your childhood, Your Honor," Sarah began, setting up her recorder. "Tell me about growing up in Charleston, South Carolina." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly. He hadn't mentioned his birthplace in any recent interviews. "You've done your homework, Ms. Johnson." "I found it interesting that you left out your Southern background in previous interviews," Sarah pressed, "especially considering your later work in civil rights." Judge McKinley shifted in his chair. "The South in the 1960s was complicated. Your father was a segregationist judge," Sarah said quietly, watching his reaction. "Yet in 1985, you became known for making one of Ohio's most significant anti-discrimination rulings. That's quite a journey." The judge stood up abruptly, walking to his window. For a moment, he just stared out at the courthouse square below. When he finally spoke, his voice was different, softer, more reflective. "My father believed in the system as it was," he said. "He used to say, 'Robert, the law is the law.' But he never questioned whether the law itself might be wrong." Sarah leaned forward. This was new information. Nothing in her research had revealed this personal conflict. "What changed for you?" The judge turned back to face her. "There was a case, back when I was in law school. A young black man, probably not much older than I was, had been wrongly convicted. The evidence was flimsy, the trial was rushed, but nobody seemed to care. I watched my father preside over the appeal, and deny it." He paused, removing his glasses to clean them, a gesture Sarah was beginning to recognize as a sign of discomfort. The man served 15 years before being exonerated. By then, his wife had left him, his children had grown up without him, his life was... The judge trailed off. "Is that why you became a civil rights advocate?" Sarah asked. "Partially," he replied, "but it was more than that. I began to see how the system I'd grown up believing in was fundamentally flawed. When I became a judge, I swore I'd be different." Sarah pulled out some court documents from her bag. "In 1985, you wrote in your ruling on the Williams discrimination case, 'Justice must not merely be blind, but also self-aware. We must constantly examine our own biases, question our assumptions, and remember that every case represents a human life, not just a number.'" The judge's face softened at his own words. "I believed that then. I still do." "Do you?" Sarah challenged gently. "Last month, you fined me $500 for a first-time traffic violation without really hearing my explanation. The average fine for similar cases in your court is $250. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. Judge McKinley's expression hardened. "Ms. Johnson, if this biography is going to be about your traffic ticket..." "It's not," Sarah interrupted. "But I have to ask, what happened to examining our own biases, to remembering that every case represents a human life?" The judge returned to his desk, his movements stiff. "Times have changed, Ms. Johnson. The system needs order, structure. We can't make exceptions for everyone with a sad story." "That's exactly what your father used to say," Sarah observed quietly. The words hung in the air between them. Judge McKinley stared at her, then at the old photographs on his wall. Images of himself with civil rights leaders, receiving awards for his groundbreaking decisions. "I think we're done for today," he said finally, his voice tight. As Sarah packed up her equipment, she noticed his hands trembling slightly as he shuffled papers on his desk. She had struck a nerve, and they both knew it. At the door, she turned back. "Judge McKinley, I found something else in my research. That young black man from your father's court, he died last year. His obituary mentioned that he spent his last 20 years helping wrongly convicted individuals rebuild their lives." The judge didn't look up, but his hands had stopped moving. "Our next interview is scheduled for Thursday," Sarah continued. "I'd like to hear more about the cases that shaped your early career." She closed the door quietly behind her, leaving Judge McKinley alone with his thoughts and the weight of his past decisions. Sarah spent 3 days straight in the courthouse archives, reviewing Judge McKinley's cases from the past 5 years. Her desk was covered with stacks of files, sticky notes, and endless cups of coffee. As a pattern emerged from the data, she felt a growing sense of unease. The numbers didn't lie. In cases involving similar offenses, there was a clear disparity in sentencing. Black defendants consistently received fines averaging 40% higher than white defendants. The same pattern appeared in jail sentences. Minorities typically got longer terms for comparable crimes. "This can't be coincidental," Sarah muttered, adding another set of statistics to her spreadsheet. Her phone buzzed. It was time for her next interview with the judge. This time, they were meeting in a small courthouse conference room. When Sarah arrived, she found Judge McKinley already there, reviewing some papers. "Your Honor," she began, setting up her recorder, "I'd like to talk about your recent cases." "Very well," he replied, still maintaining his formal demeanor. "Though I prefer to discuss my earlier work." Sarah pulled out her laptop. "I've been analyzing your rulings from the past 5 years. Would you be willing to look at some statistics with me?" The judge frowned but nodded. Sarah turned the screen toward him, showing a series of graphs and charts. "These bars represent average fines for first-time traffic violations," she explained. "The blue bars are white defendants. The red bars are minorities." The disparity was clearly visible. Judge McKinley leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. There must be other factors involved. Prior records, attitude in court. "I control for all those variables," Sarah interrupted gently. "The pattern remains consistent across all categories of cases." She switched to another chart. "This shows sentencing lengths for misdemeanor theft. Again, the difference is significant." The judge's face had grown pale. "These numbers? They can't be accurate." "They're from your own court records," Sarah said quietly. "Your Honor, do you remember telling me about your father? About recognizing systemic bias?" Judge McKinley stood up abruptly, pacing the small room. "This is different. We have guidelines now. Procedures?" "In 1986, Sarah continued, you wrote an article for the Ohio Law Review about unconscious bias in the justice system. You said that even well-meaning judges could unknowingly perpetuate discrimination if they didn't regularly examine their own decisions." The judge stopped pacing. He looked older suddenly, more vulnerable. "I wrote that?" Sarah nodded, pulling out a yellowed copy of the article. "You also started a program requiring quarterly reviews of sentencing patterns in your district. The program was discontinued in 2015. Budget cuts," he murmured, but his voice lacked conviction. "Judge McKinley," Sarah said softly, "what happened to that young judge who fought so hard for equality? When did you stop looking in the mirror?" He sank back into his chair, picking up the statistical analysis with trembling hands. "I've been on the bench for so long. You start to trust your instincts, your first impressions. You think you're being fair." "Like when I came into your courtroom?" Sarah asked. "What was your first impression then?" The judge looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time. I saw someone who thought they were above the law. Someone making excuses." He paused, swallowing hard. "I never even asked about your mother. Is she?" "She's better now," Sarah said. "It wasn't a heart attack, thankfully. Just severe anxiety." Judge McKinley nodded, still staring at the numbers on the screen. "All these years, I've been telling myself I was maintaining order, being consistent. But these statistics, they show a different story," Sarah finished for him. The judge suddenly looked very tired. "When I started, I wanted to change the system. Somewhere along the way, the system changed me instead." He picked up Sarah's copy of his old law review article. "May I borrow this? I think I need to remind myself of some things." Sarah nodded, gathering her materials. As she reached the door, the judge called out, "Miss Johnson, that first day in my courtroom, I owe you an apology." "It's not just about me, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "It's about every person who walks into your courtroom. They all deserve the judge you used to be." She left him sitting there, surrounded by evidence of how far he had strayed from his own principles. Through the conference room window, she could see him reading his decades-old words, reconnecting with a younger version of himself who had once been determined to make a difference. The biography was becoming more than just a story of one judge's life. It was becoming a mirror, reflecting back 30 years of gradual change, and perhaps, Sarah hoped, sparking a return to forgotten ideals. The tension in Judge McKinley's chambers was palpable on a warm Tuesday afternoon. Sarah sat across from him, her evidence spread across his massive desk. After weeks of interviews and research, she had finally decided it was time for the hardest conversation of all. "We need to talk about the Williams case from last month," Sarah said firmly, pulling out a thick file. The judge's face tightened. "That case is still under appeal. I can't discuss." "James Williams, age 19, Sarah continued, undeterred. "First offense for shoplifting food from a grocery store. You sentenced him to 6 months in jail. He broke the law," Judge McKinley stated flatly. Sarah pulled out another file. "Then there's Michael Peterson, also age 19, also first offense for shoplifting. Similar value of goods. You gave him probation and community service." She looked directly at the judge. "The only significant difference between these cases is that Williams is black and Peterson is white." Judge McKinley stood up, his face flushed. "You're oversimplifying complex legal decisions." "Am I?" Sarah interrupted, pulling out more files. "I have 12 similar cases from the past year alone. The pattern is impossible to ignore." She spread the files across his desk. In every case, white defendants received probation or community service. Every minority defendant received jail time. The judge began pacing, a habit Sarah had noticed he fell into when uncomfortable. "You don't understand the factors that go into these decisions." "Then help me understand," Sarah challenged. Because the judge who wrote passionate appeals for equal justice in the 1980s would never have accepted these disparities. Judge McKinley stopped at his window, staring out at the courthouse square below. Things were different then. The world was simpler. Was it? Sarah stood up, walking to join him at the window. "Or were you just more willing to fight for what was right?" She pointed to a framed photo on his wall, a younger version of himself receiving an award for judicial excellence. "That judge," she said softly, "would be ashamed of these sentencing patterns." The words hit him like a physical blow. He turned to face her, anger flashing in his eyes. "You have no right." "I have every right," Sarah cut in. "You agreed to this biography. You knew I would examine your record. Did you think I would ignore what I found?" She returned to the desk and pulled out a stack of papers. "These are letters from families affected by your recent sentencing decisions. Parents who can't see their children. Students who had to drop out of college. Lives derailed by inconsistent justice." Judge McKinley sank heavily into his chair, removing his glasses and rubbing his eyes. For the first time, he looked his age, tired, uncertain, and troubled. "I've always prided myself on being fair," he said quietly. "I know," Sarah replied. "That's what makes these statistics so shocking. You built your career fighting against exactly this kind of bias." She pulled out one final document, his own words from a 1985 speech. "Justice must be consistent, compassionate, and colorblind. When we fail to question our own decisions, we risk becoming what we once fought against." The judge stared at his old speech for a long moment. His hands were trembling slightly as he picked up the Williams case file. 6 months, he muttered, "for stealing food." He looked up at Sarah. "What happened to me?" "It happened gradually," Sarah said gently. "Year by year, case by case. Small compromises that became habits. Assumptions that went unchallenged." Judge McKinley began reviewing the files spread across his desk, really reading them this time. With each case, his face grew more troubled. "These families," he said, reading the letters, "I never considered." "You stopped seeing the people behind the cases," Sarah finished. "You started seeing categories instead of individuals." The judge stood suddenly, gathering the files. "I need to review these cases. All of them." His voice was shaky but determined. "The Williams appeal. When is it scheduled?" "Next week," Sarah replied. He nodded, already making notes. "I'll need the complete records, everything you found." He looked up at Sarah, his expression both haunted and resolute. "This isn't just about your biography anymore, is it?" Sarah shook her head. "It never was. It's about justice, the kind you used to believe in." As she packed up her materials to leave, Judge McKinley called out, "Ms. Johnson, thank you for making me look in the mirror again." Sarah paused at the door. The question is, Judge McKinley, what are you going to do about what you see? She left him there, surrounded by evidence of his own bias, watching as he began the painful process of confronting what he had become and remembering who he used to be. Over the next 3 months, Judge McKinley's courtroom underwent a remarkable transformation. Sarah watched from the back bench, taking notes as case after case revealed a judge wrestling with his conscience and working to reclaim his former principles. The Williams appeal marked the beginning of the change. Instead of his usual stern demeanor, the judge listened intently as the young man's public defender presented new evidence about his client's circumstances: a sick mother, lost job, an empty kitchen. In light of the defendant's situation and my review of similar cases, Judge McKinley announced, his voice carrying through the hushed courtroom, I am reducing the sentence to probation and community service at the local food bank. He paused, looking directly at James Williams. Sometimes justice needs to be tempered with understanding. Sarah noticed how the young man's shoulders relaxed, how his mother in the gallery wiped away tears of relief. More importantly, she noticed how the judge watched them both, really seeing them as people rather than just another case number. The following week, Judge McKinley implemented new procedures in his courtroom. He required detailed background reports for all cases, ensuring he understood the full context before making decisions. He established a system to track his sentencing patterns, reviewing them monthly for any signs of bias. Your Honor, Sarah said during one of their weekly interviews, I've noticed you're taking more time with each case. The judge nodded, reviewing his morning docket. I've started asking myself before every decision, what would the judge from 1985 do? He smiled slightly. He was a better man than I had become. One morning, Sarah arrived at the courthouse to find an unusual scene. Judge McKinley had moved his bench closer to eye level with those appearing before him. The intimidating height difference was gone. It's a small change, he explained later, but it matters. I want people to feel heard, not just judged. His transformation didn't go unnoticed. Other judges began asking questions about his new approaches. Some were skeptical, others curious. Judge McKinley invited them all to observe his courtroom. We get comfortable in our routines, he told a group of his colleagues during a lunch meeting. We forget to question our assumptions. I forgot for too long, but I'm trying to make it right. The local newspaper ran a story about the changes in courtroom 204. Justice at eye level, the headline read, describing how one of the city's strictest judges had become its most thoughtful. Sarah's favorite moment came during a case involving a teenager caught spraying graffiti. Instead of the usual fine and community service, Judge McKinley asked the boy about his art. You have talent, he told the surprised youth, but buildings aren't your canvas. He sentenced the teenager to take art classes at the community center and paint a mural for the local park, under proper supervision and with proper permits. That was creative, Sarah commented after court. I'm learning to see possibilities instead of just problems, the judge replied, like someone once wrote about me doing in the 1980s. His biggest test came with a high-profile case involving racial discrimination at a local business. The courtroom was packed, the atmosphere tense. Everyone wondered which Judge McKinley would preside, the recent harsh authoritarian or the renewed advocate for justice. His ruling left no doubt. In a passionate hour-long decision, he detailed the history of discrimination in the community and the court's responsibility to address it. His words echoed his earlier career, but with added wisdom from his recent self-reflection. We cannot claim to serve justice while ignoring inequality, he declared. I lost sight of this truth once. I won't make that mistake again. After court that day, Sarah found him in his chambers, looking at his old photographs and awards. You've changed a lot in these past months, she observed. I had help, he replied, glancing at her notepad. Your biography project became my wake-up call. He picked up a recent sentencing report. My rulings are now tracked for bias. Every decision is reviewed for consistency. I've asked the court to make these procedures mandatory for all judges. Sarah smiled, remembering their first tense encounters. And the traffic court fines? The judge actually chuckled. Completely restructured. We now consider circumstances before setting amounts. He paused. Though I still believe you ran that red light. I did, Sarah admitted. But now I know I'll get a fair hearing if I explain why. As she left his chambers that evening, Sarah reflected on how one person's transformation could affect so many lives. The biography she was writing had become more than just a story of past achievements. It was a testament to the possibility of change, even after decades of going in the wrong direction. 1 year after their first tense meeting in traffic court, Sarah sat in her publisher's office, reviewing the final draft of Judge McKinley's biography. The book, titled The Second Verdict, A Judge's Journey Back to Justice, lay finished on the desk before her. Linda Martinez, the editor who had first brought them together, flipped through the pages with growing excitement. "This is remarkable, Sarah. It's not just a biography, it's a story of redemption." "It's his story," Sarah replied, "but it's also the story of every person who came through his courtroom." She pointed to the book's final chapter. "That's why we included the statistical analysis. The changes in his sentencing patterns tell the real story." The numbers were striking. In the years since their confrontation, Judge McKinley's courtroom had shown no significant disparities in sentencing based on race. Traffic fines were now consistently proportional to both the offense and the offender's ability to pay. More importantly, his alternative sentencing programs had reduced repeat offenses by 40%. The courthouse had changed too. Other judges, inspired by McKinley's transformation, had begun implementing similar reforms. The intimidating height of judges' benches had been lowered in 3 more courtrooms. Monthly bias review sessions were now mandatory for all judges in the district. On the morning of the book's official release, Judge McKinley held a press conference in the courthouse lobby. Sarah watched from the side as he addressed the crowd of reporters and colleagues. "This biography," he began, holding up the book, "is not a celebration of my achievements. Rather, it's a confession of how justice can lose its way, and a roadmap for finding it again." He adjusted his glasses. A gesture Sarah now knew meant he was speaking from the heart. A year ago, a traffic violation case led to an unexpected journey of self-discovery. Ms. Johnson's fine was not just about running a red light. It was about seeing how far I had strayed from my own principles. He went on to announce new initiatives, a mentorship program for young judges, regular community feedback sessions, and transparent tracking of sentencing patterns across all courtrooms. After the press conference, Sarah found him in his chambers, looking at his old civil rights awards alongside his newer recognition for judicial reform. "Your mother," he said suddenly, "how is she?" Sarah smiled. "Much better. She's actually here today, in the courthouse." "I'd like to meet her," he said, "to apologize properly for that day." "You already have, Your Honor," Sarah replied. "Not with words, but with actions. Every fair ruling, every life you've impacted this past year, that's been your real apology." The book became more than just another bestseller. Law schools began using it in their ethics courses. Judicial training programs across the country incorporated its lessons about recognizing and addressing unconscious bias. 6 months after publication, Sarah received an invitation to speak at a national conference on judicial reform. Judge McKinley was the keynote speaker, and she watched with pride as he shared their story with hundreds of his peers. "One traffic fine," he told the audience, "led to a biography that forced me to confront what I had become. But this isn't just my story. It's a challenge to every person who holds power over others' lives. We must constantly examine our decisions, question our assumptions, and remember the human lives behind every case number." After the conference, they sat in the hotel lobby, reflecting on their journey from adversaries to allies. "Have you seen the latest numbers?" he asked, pulling out a report. "Courthouse-wide, our sentencing disparities are down 60%. 3 other districts have adopted our review procedures." Sarah nodded. "And James Williams? The shoplifting case that started your transformation?" The judge smiled. "He graduated from community college last week. I was invited to the ceremony." He paused. "He's applying to law school now." As they said goodbye, Judge McKinley handed Sarah an envelope. Inside was a check for $500, the amount of her original traffic fine. "I can't accept this," she protested. "Consider it a reminder," he said. "Sometimes our worst moments can lead to our greatest growth." Sarah watched him walk away, remembering their first meeting in his courtroom. The stern, uncompromising judge had become a champion for reform, proving that it's never too late to rediscover one's principles. The biography had done more than tell a story. It sparked a movement for change in the justice system. But perhaps its greatest achievement was showing that even after decades of routine and comfortable assumptions, one person's willingness to look in the mirror could transform not just their own life, but the lives of countless others. Justice, Sarah had learned, was not just about following laws. It was about maintaining the courage to question them and ourselves.